Welcome everyone to the fourth episode of TGHAT Forum. TGHAT is an initiative that was established recently to document the war in Tigray. My name is Goitom Gebreluel. I will be your moderator for this discussion. I'm also a member of the TGHAT team. The topic we'll be discussing today is international responses to the Tigray war. As many of you will know, serious atrocities have been documented in the Tigray war. This includes mass rape, starvation crimes, ethnic cleansing, massacres of unarmed civilians, and these crimes have been primarily committed by the Ethiopian government together with the their Eritrean allies. Because of the nature of these crimes, this is really much more than a civil war, and it's a matter of international security for primarily two reasons. The first one is the active involvement of a foreign state in the conflict. Secondly, the nature of these crimes possibly constitute war crimes and crimes against humanity, which means that they fall within the jurisdiction of international bodies such as the ICC and also in what one calls universal jurisdiction, which means that any other state can prosecute these crimes. My own perception and that of many Tigrayans is that the international community's ability to halt these atrocities have so far been limited. And today we'll discuss and explore the different aspects of the international responses to the Tigray war with somewhat of a comparative lens. Our two panelists today are Mukesh Kapila. He's a professor of global health at Manchester University and has had a distinguished and long career as a civil servant, both in the UK and in the UN. Notably, he was the head of UNDP in Sudan during the Darfur genocide. And he has written a number of books on mass atrocities. Our other panelist is Patrick Wight. He's a member of the TGHAT team and a familiar face to many of you. He is also a political analyst with a PhD in political science. So I would like to kick off the discussion by a general assessment of the international responses to date. As I mentioned, for many of us, it seems inadequate, but myself included and many of us in Tigray, this is really our, at least from my generation, our first encounter with mass atrocities on this scale. And so I really don't have a point of reference to compare it with. And that might be a good way of getting into the topic. So I would like to ask Mukesh, actually, how would you assess the robustness of the international response to these atrocities in Tigray, particularly compared to Darfur and other cases of mass atrocities that you have seen and encountered in your work?
Well, based on my experience, at least, of seeing atrocities in action, so to speak, in places like Rwanda, Darfur, Sudan, Bosnia, Cambodia, and so on, I would say that the response we're seeing today in relation to the crisis in Tigray is possibly the most anemic, the most feckless of all the responses that I have either been part of or witnessed at first hand. And the reason for that is the changing nature of the geopolitics, that at no one moment in recent history, by that I mean post-war history, or at least since the end of the Cold War, have we seen a Security Council so paralyzed, and also at the same time we are operating in a media age, and a lot of the kind of war is being fought in different dimensions at the same time. And this is also against a backdrop of the age of interventions. For example, we had the interventions in Afghanistan and in Syria, and all of them have ended in tears. And so we've now entered a phase where it's not that important powers don't recognize that what is going on in Tigray is really bad. And even privately, they would say that of a genocidal nature. It is just that the capability to intervene is much lower than historically it has ever been, as of course is the willingness to do so. So the long answer to your short question is that actually there is little hope for an adequate international response, at least for the foreseeable future.
Thank you. Now, as Mukesh mentioned, sometimes international responses can also be harmful. So I'm wondering, Patrick, in your view, what are the concrete things that the international community should do, and what should they avoid in responding to situations like this?
So I would begin by dividing it in terms of sort of boots on the ground or direct intervention, and sort of more peaceful non-military interventions. In terms of boots on the ground, there's at least 5 options as I see it. The first option would be a UN peace mission could be dispatched, but the problem with that is that under current conditions that requires the government's consent, which is absent in this case. Option 2 would be to have the UN Security Council authorize some form of intervention, and option 3 would be for other powers to sort of work around the Security Council as they did in Kosovo in 1999. But I would argue that oftentimes when you intervene directly with foreign militaries, like through NATO, which is usually the mechanism, that it's quite problematic that often there is not a sort of concrete goals that are set out, and in terms of the capability of foreign powers to intervene in that way and actually improve the situation, it's often quite difficult. So I would advise against that personally. But then the fourth option you have is to go through the AU, which is probably in theory a positive approach, but there's a number of sort of regional factors that make that difficult as well. And then the final option would just be simply supporting the resistance forces, the local actors on the ground that are fighting against the invading forces. In this case would be the Tigray Defense Force. And if we're talking non-military avenues, there's a lot. So R2P is often associated more with military intervention, but it means a lot more than that. There's a lot of non-violent means to intervene. So in this case, I would say pushing all sides to come to the mediation table and to form some form of national dialogue is something people seem to agree is a positive avenue. Pressuring to allow humanitarian access is something that should be non-controversial, though it has been in this conflict with, you see the government has been blocking the World Food Program convoys. Only a couple have actually been dispatched. Another avenue would be to apply international law, but that's a more long-term goal. So we've seen both the UN and Ethiopian Human Rights Commission have agreed to form a joint investigation and inquiry, but there's questions about the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission's partiality or impartiality. And then the AU has also launched the Commission of Inquiry into the crimes committed in Tigray. But those are more long-term things that can actually improve the situation on the ground in an immediate term. Another avenue is sanctions, but I would argue that broad-based sanctions are something that we should almost universally oppose because they tend to hurt people rather than regimes. And that if we're talking sanctions, what we should really be focusing on is regime officials. So things like travel bans, seizing their personal assets. Those are things that we can look into and that don't harm people on the ground. So in terms of violent and non-violent sort of means of intervening, there's a lot of sort of broader approaches that we should be avoiding, like direct military intervention and broad-based sanctions, but there's also a lot of room for intervention. It's just that we haven't seen a lot of action in the case of Tigray.
Thank you.
Well, if I may react to that, I think there's been a lot of diplomacy going on, has there not? In fact, diplomacy to actually get a formal meeting of the Security Council to take place, and that's been blocked, as you know, over many months. I think there has been a lot of effort put into trying to get humanitarian access by the UN humanitarian organizations, by the Red Cross and so on. And as we know, apart from a few trucks getting through and a couple of passenger flights, so far there has been not much else beyond that. And the question of international law still requires someone to actually initiate, someone with a locus to initiate action in some jurisdiction or some court of law, like Gambia did. I think it is Gambia did in the case of Myanmar in International Court of Justice. So, and because the African Union is located in Addis, is a hostage to the Ethiopian government in the literal sense of the term, I can't see much happening there, very much at all. I mean, I would disagree a little bit on the sanctions. That I think I would think that broad-based sanctions could be politically very helpful here in sharpening the pressure on the Ethiopian administration. The thing is that with the recent elections in Addis, in Ethiopia, there is a perceived legitimacy of the current government. And of course, this current government, and while of course people can argue about the legitimacy of the election, but nevertheless, it has provided some quasi umbrella of legitimacy to the regime we have in Addis. And by and large, the government has fed the nationalistic agenda, including with ethnocentric language. And I don't think the people of Ethiopia are sufficiently educated in the nuances to actually be able to take a principled position on this. And I don't think it's hurting enough the people converted. My experience of war is both wars of a genocidal nature and just the old-fashioned ordinary wars is that wars only end when either one side has a complete victory or both sides fight to a standstill and are exhausted and are unable to proceed further. We have seen none of that taking place at the present time. And because today, and because this war is not quite a frontline war between two protagonists, and there is the involvement of Eritrea in all this, which is a complication. I believe that there has been insufficient pain inflicted yet on the Ethiopian nation, and that means there isn't an incentive. There isn't a political incentive on the authorities in Addis to sue for a diplomatic route, and that will only happen if the ordinary civilian population of Ethiopia suffers, at least in the same direction as the people of Tigray have been suffering. So this is a very kind of, I find myself somewhat as a humanitarian finding it difficult to make this argument that actually you have to make the people suffer in order for them to come to the negotiating table. But in reality, I think this is what's going to happen and what's going to be needed if there is to be a political will constructed in Ethiopia to sit down at the table with the Tigrayan administration's representatives. So I feel the bigger the sanctions, the broader the sanctions, the greater the cost that the Addis government has to pay, the more the incentive to actually find solutions to this crisis. If, on the other hand, you kind of contain the conflict in a corner of Ethiopia, you carry on with your economic growth and development, your trade and your normal life, this can go on for 20, 30 years and may well do.
Interesting points you raised, Mukesh. You talked about the incentive for Ethiopia to pursue a political settlement or to stop the war. One thing that I found quite interesting in this conflict is the way the international community treats Ethiopia, and the way Ethiopia also manipulates the international community. There is a great deal of almost fear for ending up on bad terms with the Ethiopian government. And I suspect that's one of the reasons why it took so long for the international community to speak out in very mild terms even. So I'm curious about your sort of comparative view of the way the Ethiopian government has arm twisted the international community, and whether that's a very sort of special Ethiopian phenomenon, or whether you've seen that in your other cases of mass atrocities.
Well, I think quite a lot of it is a myth. I don't think the international community is thinking that, oh my God, Ethiopia is incredibly important and is somehow a special nation. This may feed into the nationalistic narrative or a cultural narrative of Ethiopia, of its exceptionalism, if you like, within Africa, even if I'm not even sure whether Ethiopia considers itself an African nation, because if you look at the history of Ethiopia, I mean, the cultural history and other history, it has its roots elsewhere. So, but however, the Ethiopian government has been very good through, and it's got an excellent, well-structured diplomatic community to create this kind of myth around itself. And myths, once constructed, are quite difficult to remove. On the other hand, I'm not sure there is a much great interest in any country to antagonize Ethiopia deliberately. Ethiopia is not an important country, quite honestly. It is a large country. It's got 100 million population, but then so are other countries. Economically, it was doing very well before the current madness started, but it is by no means exceptional. In Africa, there are other smaller countries like Rwanda, which are doing much better. It is not Nigeria. It is not South Africa, and it has such a back weight of poverty and underdevelopment and problems that I think the idea that Ethiopia is somehow some kind of emerging superpower or even a regional power, that myth may well have been created. But I do not think that is particularly important. It has been constructed more by Ethiopians than anything else. But the opposite is true, which is there's nothing to gain for other countries to antagonize Ethiopia unduly. If I think of India currently in the UN Security Council and so on, there are good relations between India and Ethiopia going back many decades. I remember as a child growing up in India, how many Ethiopian students had their education in India, for example. Those roots go back. Why bother upsetting those kinds of things? Or the relationship between China and Ethiopia, for example, in a way. So I think the way foreign policy is made in mature countries is that they are based on realpolitik. They're based not on emotion or some kind of mythical understandings. They're based on a calculation of interests, if you like. And there is no interest in either intervening in Ethiopia or antagonizing the government in Addis.
Interesting. I would then like to go to our second set of questions, which is what could have been different in the way the international community responded to the atrocities in Tigray. Now, one thing that I found quite fascinating and disappointing is the UN Secretary General's response to this crisis. So I'd like to ask you, Mukesh, what powers did the UN Secretary General have at his disposal that he didn't use? And how could he have acted differently? Could he have made an impact on his own? Or is his ability to act constrained by the Security Council?
Well, an interesting question. Firstly, to say that I think the Secretary General has more powers than he realizes, if you like. He has, to start with, the power of his position, the moral authority, the use of his voice, the use of his platform, and that cannot be underestimated. If you look back at history, since the UN was founded, that's been used in a number of different situations, if you like. And when the Secretary General uses that moral power, then he drags the members of the UN with him, if you like. The moral river may not be flowing at a moment in time, but the Secretary General can make the river flow in the right direction, even when initially there are rocks and obstacles in the way. So, and this particular Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, who I knew a little bit before, is by all historic standards, the most feeble of all the Secretary Generals that have ever been known since the UN was founded. Now, I know at least 2, 3 of them during my involvement, if you like, of the last 30 odd years, 1 or 2 of them even personally. And this particular one has, Antonio Guterres has made a virtue out of silence. And the story being that he is working behind the scenes in a discreet and diplomatic manner in trying to address these problems, bring people together, and so on and so forth. Well, all I can say is that it must be so discreet as to actually be almost, so discreet as to be invisible, and so invisible as to be non-existent. Because in the context we operate in, and this is the context not of the last year, this is the context of the last 10 odd years, if you like. This not the way in which international relations are conducted are much more visible. Today, if it hasn't happened on Twitter, it hasn't happened. So you can do all your discreet diplomacy that you like, but if it ain't on Twitter, it ain't happened, if you like, you see. Because similarly, if you haven't announced what you're doing, if you haven't reported on what you are doing, if you haven't communicated what efforts you're making, and no one expects you to succeed all the time, but they certainly expect you to communicate. Meanwhile, those who are up to bad deeds get comfort from the silence. So I would say Antonio Guterres is using his power in a very negative way by his silence. Now, in formal terms, actually, the Security Council, the Secretary General has the power under the Charter to be able to demand a hearing by the Security Council. And in the end, this is what happened in the case of Darfur, that when I spoke up, and the Security Council was not reacting initially, but there was such a reaction, partly because of I spoke on the media, and I was ahead of the UN in Sudan at the time, not an activist, if you like. You know, I was in the United Nations. Then there was no option but for this Kofi Annan to actually demand that the Security Council meet, and the Secretary General has a power under the UN Charter to be heard, if you like, to demand to be heard, even if the powers of the Security Council don't want to meet. The right of initiative is there in the Charter, and he hasn't used it at all. And then, of course, don't forget, we have the General Assembly. So, all through long history, the Security Council was in a very bad way during the Cold War, but the world didn't come to an end. There were many things that happened, and there are powers in the General Assembly to debate, to discuss, to pass resolutions at the very least, if the Security Council is unwilling and unable to do so. And these are only some of the measures that he has at his disposal.
Thank you. now if I can get back to you, Patrick, you outlined some avenues for regional intervention. What do you see as the limitations and benefits of acting through the AU or IGAD in cases like this?
Yeah, so I would argue in terms of neocolonialism that is attached to the R2P doctrine and other forms of human rights norms. And so going through the regional and continental mechanisms allows you to sort of diffuse those concerns in a large respect. And also there's the reality that the AU's constitutive act actually gives the AU more power than the R2P norms do to intervene in the cases of a disruption of peace and mass killing. And there's also, in terms of boots on the ground, there is an East African standby force that was established in 2009. And it is well positioned, again, in theory, to intervene, but we've seen no push by the AU to intervene in this way. The other mechanism is the regional, which you mentioned, IGAD, which was in many ways established by the former government of Ethiopia, the EPRDF regime, and it was imperfect, but in many ways it was able to maintain a certain degree of stability in the region during that period. But now we've seen with the alliance formed between Ethiopia, Eritrea, and Somalia that IGAD has essentially become defunct in many ways in its conflict resolution capacity. So working through IGAD anymore is not really a fruitful option. In terms of accountability, again, with the ICC, when you go through the ICC, there's the charges that the ICC tends to disproportionately go after African leaders. So in this way, another option that could be brought to the table is a hybrid court where the AU and the national courts establish some form of accountability mechanism. We saw that in South Sudan, and that was in the 2015 peace agreement. The idea of establishing a hybrid court was written into it, but that hasn't actually come to fruition yet. So in terms of the barriers to regional intervention, they're very much the same as the more global factors, where you have African leaders concerned about their strategic interests, including economic and diplomatic relations with other African states, issues over regional security. Also, African leaders fear that if it becomes a norm to sort of start bringing other African leaders to the ICC or a hybrid court established by the AU, that then the knock will come at their door one day. So they're a little bit fearful in terms of actually implementing these norms as well. So in terms of the ability for regional intervention, it's much the same in terms of there are very viable options on the table, but there's a resistance in many senses to actually intervene and to use them.
Absolutely. I think, Patrick is right that there are options, but the prospects of them actually being used are highly improbable. There are a number of other paradoxes I think we need to highlight. I don't buy the colonial narrative idea. This is an excuse to hide behind. Most countries have been decolonized for a long time, and they can't carry on using colonial and blame the colonial history for the problems of today. And this is a self-serving argument and should be called as such. The second thing I would say is, if we are postulating that what is happening in Tigray are crimes against humanity of a genocidal nature, crimes against humanity are crimes against all humanity everywhere. And I find it a little bit weak to be talking about African solutions for African problems in this particular context. I think, and I can't think of any intervention that's ever been made by any regional body in a situation of this type without a prior authorization by the United Nations Security Council. if you like. Even the creation of hybrid missions, etc., and interventions in the sovereign country under Chapter 7. So what I'm saying is, we demean the suffering of the people of Tigray. We are undervaluing it. We are saying that, yep, we want to intervene in the case of Myanmar or in the case of Bosnia or elsewhere, which required the whole world to intervene through the Security Council and so on. But in the case of Tigray, let us reduce this to a regional matter. Apart from the fact that regional matter, that the regional organizations are completely paralyzed for all sorts of reasons, which are very familiar to everyone, it actually denigrates the suffering of the people of Tigray. It says that the genocidal suffering of the people for Tigray is not as important as the genocidal suffering of other populations in other parts of the world, historically or recently, that required somehow a global authorization and a global intervention, with or without a military. So I'm against when crimes against humanity are concerned, they become matters for all of humanity, and nothing less than a global authorization, a global response is justified. And I don't think regional courts or regional mechanisms are, quite honestly, the way to go down. Because for the reasons we know, they by the time they come into existence, genocide will be complete. But more importantly, this will not then be given the weight that is needed. So in the end, people like what happened in the case of Rwanda was there was a court set up, but it was a court authorized by the Security Council. In the case of Sierra Leone, there was a court set up by authorization of the Security Council. So it's not just hybrid courts are a good idea, like, for example, also in Cambodia. But if a hybrid court means a compromise, no, a regional mechanism, a regional court, or a national body or a national court must be a partner of, but a junior partner of ultimately a global consortium, because of the nature of the crime of what it is a crime of all crimes, putative genocide.
Excellent points, Mukesh, and it's interesting. In the case of Tigray, this regional or this security apparatus, global security apparatus, which gives a lot of weight and power to regional actors, is what has prevented putting Tigray on the agenda on the Security Council due to opposition from the African countries. So in this case, we can see how harmful that mechanism can be.
Well, it provides an alibi. It provides an alibi. You see, when the bigger international community doesn't wish to act, it can always fall back. ASEAN has to deal with Myanmar. African Union has to deal with, or IGAD has to deal with Ethiopia, right? It's actually an alibi for inaction.
True. This brings me to my next question, which is one thing that was really problematic for us Tigrayans during this process was getting Tigray on the agenda. And between November and February, it was literally not on the agenda, even in the media. So for months and months, it was difficult to get even drawing attention to what was going on, let alone action. And I'm curious from your other experiences, is this type of negligence, the norm, or was Tigray different? And what sort of lessons can be learned from this experience?
Well, I think I don't think Tigray and Tigrayans should feel bad about this one. I'm afraid this is the norm. I mean, I remember jumping up and down and ranting to try and get it some attention for Darfur for the first 6 months, if you like, roughly 6 months, before suddenly the world woke up. If you look at other situations, there is a necessarily long gestation period before there is sufficient awareness, a certain confluence of concern, and that reaches a weight that at least finds a place in consciousness of both policymakers and people and media, in comparison with the many things that are going on around the world. Not least is COVID. And then, of course, we have climate change, which is now very much on the agenda. And we have other crises and conflict and so on that we're all aware of, if you like to see. So I would say this is quite normal. I would say that actually it's not bad that 9-10 months later, this is on the map. Though I think the nature of the competitive attention-seeking business nowadays is that it's harder nowadays to get attention than it might have been the case 10 years ago, if you like to see, because it's got tougher, in other words. The other problem is that by constantly flogging dead horses, people switch off. By constantly demanding, oh, the Security Council should do this, and the Security Council, we know, is not going to do this, is unable to do this. By constantly saying Secretary General should do that, but we know perfectly well he's not going to do that, partly at least a nature of his personality, which none of us are going to change at his advanced age. So what we're doing is we create an atmosphere of impunity founded on boredom, founded on the fact that by asking for something that is not deliverable, at least in the short term, one day it might be, it might be that something happens tomorrow or next month, and then suddenly the dynamic will be different, and it can happen. But the way things are going now, I'm not sure what more there is to do in terms of awareness raising, but or what we are asking people to do. Because there isn't going to be a military intervention. There isn't going to be UN sanctions. There isn't going to be anything other than drip drabs of humanitarian access. There isn't going to be anything more than frustrated diplomacy, and many people speaking up to saying that. And there isn't going to be any change in the mindset in Addis, unless somebody makes that mindset happen through some measures, which flips the whole dynamic. In that context, you have to be careful that over-awareness leads to a stage of basically, we get there, and then there is a kind of stalemate. So I guess what I'm saying is that we should really be thinking about what the next stage is, having got to where we are now, and with a realistic understanding of where we are right now, which is not in a very good place in most aspects. From my view, I think history is on our side, and it also gives us some harsh lessons. The positive side of history is that no genocide in the world has ever succeeded. It extracts huge human costs, but ultimately it's overcome, and this too will be overcome. That's the kind of positive message. However, that message is of no consolation to people who are starving, people who have been raped, to people who are hungry, and all the rest of it now. It's easy for us to say this in retrospect. It's not very easy to say this to people who are suffering right now. And there's other aspect of genocide. The more harsh reality of genocide is that no genocide has ever been stopped or reversed except through the application of force. You look at any genocidal history since the Second World War, at least, and maybe probably even before, no genocide in history has ever been stopped or reversed except through the application of armed force. And that armed force has either come from external intervention, which from, say, neighboring countries like Vietnam in the case of Cambodia, or Tanzania in the case of Uganda, or various people in the case of Sierra Leone, or NATO in the case of Bosnia, or it has come from within, in the sense of the Rwandans who organized themselves in Uganda and finally removed the genocidal regime in Kigali. So I am pinning my prediction on the people and armed capacities of Tigray to establish a military situation that will put them in a position that will, number one, protect their people so that aid and other humanitarian assistance can get in. And number two, it can change the facts on the ground, and the best way to change politics on the ground is to change facts on the ground. So I'm afraid I only see a military solution to this. And because the international community is not going to intervene for reasons we've already discussed, I think this is going to only happen if somehow, I think the Tigrayan side is able to establish their position.
Thank you, Mukesh. This is indeed what we've been seeing over the past 8 months, with the almost total lack of international response and the Tigrayans taking matters into their own hands and creating new military dynamics through the Tigray Defense Forces. I would like to go to our final set of questions. So mass atrocities and the global response to these events seems to me to tend to go in almost cyclical processes in which the response to one atrocity shapes the response to the next one. So my understanding is that the lack of an adequate response to Rwanda, the response, the legacy of that was never again, and the response to what happened in Libya and the Libyan humanitarian intervention has really made humanitarian intervention unappealing to a lot of international actors. So I'm curious the extent to which the response to the atrocities in Tigray are going to leave a legacy of some sort. So in particular, do you expect any sort of accountability processes or self-rectifying, soul-searching within the UN or AU as a response to their inability to prevent these atrocities, or is it going to be business as usual?
Well, maybe Patrick can have a go at that first.
Well, I would say there's a number of factors that we've identified that are sort of just pervasive in the international system, and we don't see them going away. So the first one, like you identified, is the lack of political will. So after the Rwandan genocide, there was sort of a very big push to say never again, and that led to the creation of the R2P norm and all sorts of other innovations in international law. But at this point, that's still more of a soft law, as they call it, in that it's more a rhetorical device, and its actual implementation is lagging in terms of people's acceptance of the norm in a sort of broader sense. The second sort of factor that is going to limit the ability to intervene is just capacity, like the capacity of international actors to intervene. And so you see a sort of dichotomy where when they don't intervene, like you say, there's a sort of uproar of why didn't you intervene more? Why didn't you do more? And then when they do intervene, sort of there's a lot of criticism about how they intervene. So the case of Yugoslavia is controversial in a number of ways in terms of the NATO military intervention, and the same can be said of Syria. There's a lot of, I think, legitimate criticisms of that. But then if you take military intervention off the table, you take sanctions off the table, then you say, okay, well then, what are we actually able to do as the international community to actually stop these events when they're taking place? And so you're not left with a whole lot. I would say the third sort of factor that continues to limit the ability to implement R2P is its continual sort of association with the past regime of humanitarian intervention, which was associated with great powers in the world sort of manipulating humanitarian objectives to sort of pursue their own geostrategic imperatives. So like the big example is the Iraq War, which was cloaked in sort of democracy promotion and all sorts of other supposed humanitarian goals. So it's very difficult to disentangle the sort of legitimate imperative to respond to mass atrocities and then the sort of cynical manipulation by both the international community of mass atrocities to pursue their own goals and by the national governments, which we see in the case of Ethiopia. You've seen Abiy Ahmed's regime sort of using both the language of state sovereignty and of cultural relativism in a sense to cover for their crimes. And for me, those are very sort of hollow defenses of what the regime is undertaking, because with the R2P norm, we accept that state sovereignty is not absolute, that if a state is unable to protect its citizens, then the international community does have a right to intervene. And also in cases of disputed sovereignty, you'd say, well, who actually does control like the region of Tigray? Is it the federal government of Ethiopia or is it the Tigrayan forces? In terms of cultural relativism, again, it's a very cynical employment of these terms from the national government in that there is no sort of cultural basis for a mass extermination campaign or using rape as a weapon of war. But you often see arguments that come from a place of, well, Western analysts or Western human rights organizations are criticizing, and sort of both national sovereignty and cultural relativism are used as sort of like a patina to sort of allow the national government to get away with its crimes. And so it's a constant balance between Western powers, because they have a very negative history of intervention in the developing world, and a very negative, even current history in terms of their economic relations and their security engagement with things like AFRICOM, that there is a legitimate sort of imperative to push back against neo-imperialist intervention. But then we can't allow that to say we're not going to act in any way, and that when a genocide is taking place, that, you know, human rights organizations trying to intervene in some way, that is now being defined as neo-imperialism. I think that's a very dangerous sort of step that some people are taking, where almost any intervention into authoritarian regimes, into cases of mass murder, are being defined as imperialist actions in some corners of the discourse. And I think it's very sort of difficult to disentangle what is an imperialist intervention and what is a humanitarian intervention. But it's something that the international community really has to clarify.
Yeah, but it's difficult. I would say that when history is written, say 20 years from now, people will be saying that they hadn't realized it, but the Third World War had started, and Tigray was just a battlefront, one of the battlefronts in the Third World War. I mean, you know, we're used to the First World War, we're used to the Second World War, and somehow we think that the Third World War is going to be like those wars. No, I think the Third World War, which started probably some time ago and gradually has crept up upon us, is being waged on many, many different fronts. Erosion of democracies, obviously, but erosion of democratic values within nominal democracies, if you like, you see. Much more clever way, much more clever to how the way to destroy these things is from within. We have all the information wars that are going on. And now I'm sure you've been reading up in the media about Pegasus and the surveillance, cyber surveillance war that has been going on, right? And totalitarian values are probably a default mode now in many, many cultures, democracies and non-democracies, if you like. And that's not helped by the rise of existentialist threats that affect all humanity, and be they disease epidemics, pandemics, or what we have not seen the worst yet, even though the last 2-3 weeks have actually given us a taste for it, which is what's going to happen when climate change really bites, as it will do within the next 5 years, much more so. So we may find then that we are already embarked on a global war. And that global war has a number of fronts to it, some of which I mentioned, and it is a number of physical fronts to it. And Tigray is one of those fronts, in a way. So I think the legacy of Tigray is pretty bad for everyone else, because it just reconfirms, in a sense, the culture of impunity, which was there before this conflict started, but definitely it's been encouraged by this conflict. And definitely we can say that authoritarians can do whatever they like, and they're probably going to be able to get away with it. So, I mean, if you were to finish now, it would be a completely hopeless moment to finish on, and this would be utterly so depressing as to kind of be fairly pointless, if you like to even have this discussion in a way. And my intention is not to depress us all, because I'm actually an optimistic person by nature. And the reason I'm optimistic by nature is because I have seen repeatedly over 30, 40 years the extraordinary survival capacities and adaptation capacities and resilience of people under the most hopeless circumstances, whether the threats are of environmental nature or whether they are due to issues of war. And so what we see is that this is a war we have to go through, a war of values, if you wish. If there was one overarching kind of purpose in all these different fields of war that are simultaneously coming together in this Third World War, it is that it's a war of values, and we are all engaged in it. This is not just fought by soldiers on the front line. In fact, soldiers are not that stupid. Nowadays, hardly any soldier gets actually killed, because they sit behind their computer screens launching missiles and drones, and they're so well protected in their modern armor that you've got to be jolly lucky to actually kill a soldier. It's the poor civilians that are hurt in all this. Therefore, we are all now in it. We're all in it. We're at the front line, and the front line cuts across physical boundaries, and it cuts across cyberspace, and it cuts across all the other boundaries, intellectual and others that you can think of, including psychological, including mental torture, mental health, which we learned a little bit about from the effects of COVID. You can imagine in a parallel what it would be otherwise. Now, what I feel that needs to happen in Tigray and other situations is, firstly, there needs to be solidarity among the victims. The reason despots and totalitarians are able to divide and rule is that we have activists for Myanmar, we have activists for Tigray, we have people who have got a special interest in something else, and they're all separate universes. It is only when oppressed people, tortured people, raped people, starved people find common ground across all the spaces where such things take place, that we will have enough army of the mind and heart to confront this war. That's number one. The number two is that I don't think external intervention is going to be the answer, for the reasons spelled out very well by Patrick. One, we're pretty awful at doing interventions because you're stupid. The classic cases of Afghanistan, how to turn perfectly well argued original intervention into a disaster without even trying. if you like, you see. We're just bad at it. Not because the intervention is bad, but we're bad at executing it, if you like. And that's going to not going to improve, because of the nature of multinational interventions. They're weird. I mean, there are all sorts of crazy people, you know, generals have different ideologies, backgrounds that come. Even I remember from my experiences in Bosnia, we were arguing about policing. Do we go down the British system of policing, or do we go down the Italian carabinieri system in Bosnia? And we can't even agree on that, if you let alone judicial and others. So it's not good idea to intervene, even if the world was politically had the will to do so. So that leaves us only with one thing. And I think we should be more open about it. We should be more courageous in talking about it. And we should not be afraid to pay the price if necessary for talking about and doing it. And that is resistance. Resistance, which can mean armed resistance. If you are a person who has skills in warfare and has access to arms, and your cause is to do that, then I, for one, am not standing in the way of any armed force that wishes to use weaponry to protect its own people. And there is an international law, there is a right to defense of the existentialist fundamental human right, which is the right to live. So if someone's right to live is affected, and someone is trying to protect that right, the use of force, I'm not the one going to say you can't do that, because it's not being sanctioned by the Security Council, it's whatever it is, if you like to see. So I think armed resistance is going to be needed. More armed resistance in many situations is going to be needed, number one. Number two, I think we are going to have to get much smarter in other forms of resistance. Whether it's cyber resistance, whether it is getting smarter at the information wars, whether it is finding ways of undermining the economies and cultural positions of genocidal authoritarian regimes, whether it is taking away whatever fragile platforms they have to prosecute and present their cases. So this is a multi-dimensional war of resistance. And people should, around good-minded people who believe in the rhetoric of human rights, who believe in the rhetoric of liberties, if you like, then they must be prepared to become, I don't want to use the word soldiers, but strugglers, at least in this struggle, whether they are a soldier on the ground or whether they are operating in their own dimension, whether they're a doctor. So today, for example, and I know this from my experience in warfare, today it is not necessary. I already said that no soldier dies in a war nowadays. Generally, that's true. Hardly any soldier dies. If a soldier dies in a war, then I think you have to call into question the competence of the generals in command, if you like. So if Ethiopian soldiers are dying in the conflict in Tigray, this is to the utter disgrace of the Ethiopian generals who have not trained them properly, who have not armed them properly, haven't got the right strategy behind them. They're just stupid, if you like, if they're sending soldiers to die in wars. Okay. But if you happen to be wounded, hardly anybody caught in a conflict with a wound, if you like, ever dies nowadays, whether a soldier or a civilian, because we had the technology and the means available to save. I mean, if a bomb lands on your head and you die, may your God look after you. But what I mean to say is, even if you're a health worker, a medical worker like I am by background, there are ways of fighting this. So the use of our skills to ensure that if a person is damaged, hurt in some way, we maximize their chances of survival and thereby send a signal of resistance, if you like. I think you're getting what I'm saying, I hope, in my long way to say that in this Third World War, Tigray is a battlefront, but it is not on its own. that battlefront has to be addressed by looking at the whole battle in the world going on. We are all engaged in this battle in our different roles wherever we are, whether behind Zoom or whether on the ground with a gun. And if you believe in these common values of humanity, and you're against crimes against humanity, etc., then join the struggle and support whoever is doing that. So I'm for supporting the resistance in Tigray through every means possible. And the message for the friends of Tigray, whether they're Tigrayan expatriates or whether they are any well-wishers who believe in the values we have talked about, is support them in every possible way. So number one, they're victorious militarily on the ground. And secondly, they're victorious in the battle for hearts and minds. And thirdly, they're victorious in terms of saving the maximum lives and livelihoods of their people, because by doing that, you are stopping the genocide from being completed. And as I said earlier, we can be optimistic because no genocide has actually ever succeeded.
Superb. That was a very inspiring and encouraging way to conclude discussion on a rather dark topic. So thank you very much, Mukesh. We are out of time, unfortunately, and we have to end the discussion here. We've only scratched the surface of a very important topic. One of the things we haven't talked about is Ethiopia's agency in all of this. I'm very curious about how it has navigated this process. I think that has been an important factor, and certainly an issue we will look into further in our future discussions. So thank you very much to both Patrick and Mukesh for taking time to engage in this discussion with us. And thank you very much to the viewers for tuning into this discussion. We'll see you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.